Now I'd like to introduce this week's speaker. I'm proud to share that Mr. Affield and his wife Patty are our neighbors. And good neighbors they are. They live only 3 miles from us. The only unfortunate thing is that they live in Beltrami County rather than Clearwater. Some time ago, I read Wendell's book, Muddy Jungle Rivers, and I read it with some hesitation, because if I were to write a book about myself, I have a tendency to be a little bit more generous about what I've done than I perhaps had done. And I was surprised that Wendell hadn't. It was very factual. If anything, he erred on the side of modesty. Perhaps it could best be presented by a neutral party. This was a woman that wrote into Amazon after reading his book, and this is what she said, I quote, "I read this book in a day, as I couldn't put it down. There has been too much silence about the reality of war, silence that has not necessarily produced healing for the first victims of war, those who are trained to kill. I can only believe that many soldiers are silent upon returning home because of shame or because they intuit that many of us do not want to know about the reality of war. The author has broken the silence, and he has done it publicly. I found Muddy Jungle Rivers to be well written and beautifully, sometimes painfully, descriptive. Having not experienced the unnatural situation of combat firsthand, I felt I could trust his words partly because there's no perceived agenda. That is, the author is simply telling us what he remembers experiencing. This takes honesty and courage, as well as craftsmanship, and in my mind is what makes Muddy Jungle Rivers a success. I hope more veterans will tell their stories." End quote. With that, I present Wendell Affield.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John and Tamara and Northern Exposure for Lifelong Learning for inviting me to speak here today. I'd like to recognize all veterans in the room. If you would please stand up. Thank you very much. No, 9% of our population has served in the military. And everybody has a unique story to tell, be it peacetime or wartime. I have a friend that I did quite a few writing workshops with. His name is Gail. In fact, he was raised up by Greenbush. He lives down in the cities now. He's in his 70s, and he served about the same time Elvis Presley did, in the mid-50s between Korea and Vietnam. And he wrote this book. It's mainly for his family, his children and grandchildren, but he did a super job. It's filled with humor, and it's got a ton of pictures in it. And he served most of his time in Germany. And, you know, again, it's a unique story. It's a perspective that I certainly wasn't familiar with. So, again, like I say, we all have a story to tell. I'm often asked why I enlisted in the Navy. And for some of you may not know, I was raised on a farm about 25 miles east of here over by Nevish. I'm going to just read the first page of my book. And this, in the spring of 1964, my 2 older brothers had left our farm already, and I decided I'm not going to bust my butt this summer. And so when school got out, I packed a little bag and took off till I was 16 years old. And my voice is kind of scratchy, bear with me. Anyway, I hopped a freight car and rode the rails out to Seattle to visit my grandmother. And I spent a couple weeks with her and got bored and drove her bananas. And so I hopped a freight car back towards Minnesota, not planning on coming home because the haying wasn't done. So I spent a little bit of time in the hobo camps in Wenatchee and Spokane area, and it was interesting. Now when I look back on it, there were so many veterans, and at the time as a 16-year-old kid you didn't have these realizations. but there were so many veterans, and in the early 60s, there were a lot of World War I veterans yet. Well, I'm sure that well over 50% of them probably had severe PTSD, okay? Today you read about the high percent of homeless veterans, and the vast majority of them have PTSD. Well, back in those days, there was the hobo camps and free transportation on freight cars was kind of a way of living for them. Anyway, I spent a little time in hobo camps and hopped a train and got kicked off in Whitefish, Montana, and started hitchhiking, and this old rancher picked me up and hired me, and so I ended up putting up hay for him next. Can't win. But anyway, I got home in time for school, and having spent that summer on the road, and I just really lost interest in school. I struggled along until about Christmas time, and I decided I've had enough school. I was halfway through the 11th grade. And there's not much employment in the Bemidji area for a high school dropout in 1964. There isn't today. But my mother signed me to enlist in the Navy because I was only 17. And so a year and a half later, when my class did graduate, I was over in the Gulf of Tonkin as a pilot rescue swimmer on a destroyer. Well, a couple of years later, I was back there on a river patrol boat. And the type of boat I was on, if you're familiar with the old World War II landing craft, the LCM-6s that you see hitting the beaches and dropping the ramps, that's the type of boat I was on. The Navy retrofitted them with armor plating and machine gun turrets, and we had a 7-man crew, Navy crew on our boat. I was a coxswain, I drove it. And our mission was, we were mainly designed to operate in the Mekong Delta, where the ground is only about 2 feet above sea level. And there's not many roads, so waterways were the main mode of transportation, our boats, sampans, whatnot. So we were partnered with the Army, the 9th Infantry, 2nd Brigade, and our main mission was to transport troops to their operating areas and to operate with them. We block the rivers and whatnot. On August 18, 1968, I was part of a column of boats going up a narrow canal, and we got in a pretty bad ambush. We had a full platoon of troops on board, and we took several rockets and whatnot, but 3 of the rockets detonated right over the well deck, the area where the troops were, and shrapnel sprayed down on them, and it pretty much incapacitated that whole platoon in about 3 seconds. Right during those moments, a rocket burned through the armor into the little compartment I was in driving the boat, and I was medevac back to the States. I spent a little time in a hospital in Japan, and ended up at Great Lakes Naval Hospital, north of Chicago. Well, when I got discharged from the Navy, they sent me to the VA hospital in Chicago, and so I got in the VA system. And my 2 older brothers that had left earlier lived in northern Illinois, so I settled down there and found a job as a meat cutter apprentice, which was a trade I ended up in for the next 30 years. And I started a family down there. In 1980, the company I worked for sold out, and my wife and my family moved back to Bemidji here. And I found a job driving truck for Land O'Lakes the winter of 1980. And I did that for a couple of years until I got back into the meat business. And for the next 15 years about, I managed a butcher shop at Lucan's Village Foods. And during those years, I naturally visited with thousands of people, because I was mainly out front, doing PR and whatnot. And I talked to, a lot of people knew me just because I had been raised up here, and just, I would be on the radio doing commercials and whatnot. And over the years, many World War II vets came in and visited with me. And over the years, a few of them told me their stories of trauma. And they begin telling me a story, and they get choked up and teary-eyed and walk away. And I didn't realize till many years later that two things. It was probably the anniversary of their trauma. It was probably the day, or very close to the day, they had been wounded or taken prisoner or whatnot. And the second thing I realized, it was probably the first time they'd ever told anyone. So, that was interesting, and it was really a heartfelt lesson for me. At that time, I had no way to know what was going on. I didn't understand, and it just made me extremely uncomfortable the way they had reacted. They just walked away, and their stories died with them. You know, they probably never did tell anyone. In 1990, the VA, in the early 90s, the VA started doing Agent Orange physicals for veterans that had been in country. And I got a notice and went into Fargo VA for the physical, and a young doctor took care of me. And he saw on my records that I forget, I think it was like 20% disability check I didn't get. It was probably a whole whopping $38 or whatever at that time. Anyway, he asked me why I was getting a disability. And I told him, you know, I started telling him what happened, and I started getting choked up and teared up, and I was really surprised that it happened. And I didn't know how to react to it. Well, he asked me if I had ever been tested for post-traumatic stress disorder. And I said, what's that? Didn't have a clue, never had heard of it. And so they scheduled an appointment for me, and I talked to a shrink, and yeah, I got diagnosed with PTSD. And, you know, it's just one of those things that you live with, and I worked till I retired in 2001. When I retired, let me back up a moment. When they diagnosed me with PTSD, they recommended that I go to this veteran support group in Bemidji. And I did go there for a while, but I didn't feel like I was getting anything out of it. The main thing I got out of it was meeting some other Vietnam veterans. To this day, we've formed some close friendships, and we get together for breakfast once in a while. But in 2001, when I retired, I remembered these old World War II vets, and I realized I knew that I had stories to tell, and I knew that if I didn't tell them, they were going to die with me. And fortunately, one of the customers that would come in and visit with me, her name was Susan Carol Hauser, and I knew she worked at BSU. What I didn't know is that she was the chair of the English department. So not long before I retired, she came in, I was visiting with her, and I told her that I'd like to learn how to write. And so she, without hesitating, she said, take a class with Mark Christensen. And so that autumn, I registered at BSU for this writing class, and figured, no, I hadn't really been in classes much since I walked out of high school in 1964, so I was pretty nervous. And I went in, and here's this man, and he has a very deep voice, very intimidating, if any of you know Mark. Mark is a wonderful person. With anyone else, I probably would not have this book out here. I can safely say that. When I first started writing, I couldn't read what I wrote. And the way these writing classes work, you'd have a writing assignment, and you might work on it for a week and a half or 2 weeks, and then pass out a copy to the class, and the class, everybody's doing this. The class would critique it, over the next few days, and then in the class period, 4 or 5 students' stories would be read out loud and critiqued. Each student would read their story. Well, I couldn't read my story. I'd get all choked up, so Mark read for me. And that was a huge help for me. And the students' critiques were just invaluable. Getting their insights was a huge influence on how this book turned out, because I wanted to be able to relate our story to a younger audience. My early stories, I call them memory stories, because we don't think about it. You know, we have our 5 senses. Some have 2 cents. But we have the hearing, the touch, the taste, vision, the smell. And memories are connected to our senses. Just for example, when my wife is baking popcorn today in microwaves, you don't put it on the stove and shake it. But when I smell that popcorn or I hear it popping, I don't will myself to, but I just automatically, I think of when I was a little kid up on the farm in Nevish. At Christmas time, we used to take needle and thread and make garlands for our Christmas trees. And I just, unconsciously, that thought comes to my mind. Well, so when I started writing these first stories, I naturally wrote stories that I remembered from my senses. And the first story, in fact, I wrote, sense of smell is my most powerful trigger, and I think it is for a lot of people. The first story I wrote was about pulling a decomposing body from a river. And it, you know, it was, whatever, it's in the book. Things I discovered as I was writing. I didn't realize at the time that writing is actually a recognized PTSD therapy. But I discovered several things. Putting my stories on paper helped me take control of them. Okay, before they were just memories, and I came to realize as I moved along that if I put these stories in chronological order, it made more sense to the experience. And as time moved forward, I started writing a few good memories. Here's an example of a good memory that I wrote. And this is, we're deep into a 10-day operation in a very southern part of Vietnam. It's in called the U Minh Forest. And no foreigners had been there since the French left in 1954. So the kids down there were pretty fascinated by us. But what our normal procedure would be, we'd drop the Army troops off, and they'd go on a search and destroy sweep looking for the bad guys. And we'd move upriver, downriver, whichever, and pick them up when they'd circle around back to the river. And we'd act as a blocking force so the enemy couldn't cross the river. But this particular day, we were beached by a little hamlet. There was a couple of fishermen's hooches and a few families living around there. And we were just kind of killing the day. It got it's boring when you're in the war. Most 99% of the time you're extremely bored. And so in the afternoon, me and a couple of guys grabbed our small arms, and I always carry a 12-gauge pump. But anyway, we made a little patrol about 100 yards in, and we came back out to the riverbank. And anyway, I returned to the riverbank and found another boat crew lounging in the shade of coconut trees. They had enticed children into climbing trees, cutting the large nuts, and tossing them down. I was amazed how kids scampered up the trunks and danced around the crown like small monkeys. It was a happy afternoon as we lazed in the shade, hacking through thick husks to the coconuts, savoring the sweet juice and white meat, playing with the children. That evening, the Army troops bivouacked near the riverbank. Sarge came aboard and told us it had been a quiet day, but he expected to see trouble the next day. Before dawn, the troops boarded the boat and we moved deeper into the U Minh Forest. So that was kind of a happy memory that I wrote. I'll just read the first paragraph here of this opening chapter. Drizzling clouds enshrouded dawn. Along the riverbank, palm leaves shimmered limp and rice paddies lay abandoned. And raged hands snapped vampire mosquitoes, and blood trickled down the exposed skin of men who sat tensely in the well deck this 8th day of the operation. You think we got mosquitoes up here? We don't. Let me tell you. So it took me about 10 years to write this book because I was learning how to write. I went from being a butcher to a writer, and it's kind of like going from a butcher to being a brain surgeon, maybe. Anyway, one of the things that I discovered were the World War I poets and World War I authors. I don't know if anyone's familiar with them. Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, Robert Graves. I really got into poetry. I started writing quite a bit of poetry. I rediscovered a book that I had read as a kid on the farm, All Quiet on the Western Front, by Maria Remarque. And his story really resonated with me because he was a German soldier in World War I. He was on the losing side too, so I could really relate to his story. But the main thing that I liked about all of World War I authors was their tone of waste and angst, and Owens calls it the pity of war. Not pitying the veterans, but the waste and the pity of war, the destruction of it, is what came through so clear with all these authors. And no one in Vietnam saw any waste like was on the Western Front, be it in World War I, don't get me wrong. But it was the mindset that they portrayed and came across so powerfully. And so I tried to, John mentioned the tone of the book, I tried to weave that in. Much of the book was written early in the morning. I get up, 3 or 4 in the morning. I read poetry for an hour maybe, just to get my mind in that mindset that I wanted to have. And the stories kind of evolved and developed, but I felt something was missing, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And I took this history of the Vietnam War class, and I learned the anti-war protester point of view. And I thought, that's what's missing, because there was a lot of dissension over there. It wasn't overt, but for example, on our boat, the radio man was a college graduate, and he was very against the war. He had enlisted in the Navy to avoid getting drafted into the Army, so here he was hauling Army troops around. It didn't do him much good. But anyway, he was very vocal about, being opposed to the war and that we shouldn't be involved. And I thought, that's what's missing in this book. So I did a major rewrite. And I made him the vehicle to pass that information, to be the conduit of information for the reader, to reveal that side of the war. And I think I was quite successful with it. I've gotten a lot of good comments. It's not an anti-war book, don't get me wrong. I try to, he discusses things or makes comments. It's through dialogue that I reveal the anti-war point of view. The book is written from a 20-year-old sailor's point of view, because that's the way my memories were. I was a kid, and that's how I wanted the story to come across. It's not much retrospective. Some of the things I do that is kind of interesting, and people have commented, our farm was just south of the Red Lake Indian Reservation, and so when we were kids, we used to go up to powwows and whatnot, and we'd have, I don't know if some of you remember in the old days, and I imagine around here they did, the Indians would come down and sell walleye fillets and venison hindquarters out of their trunks, packed in ice. And somehow they always knew when we were butchering in the fall, and I remember we used to trade them our hog heads for walleye fillets. But anyway, and when we were kids, we used to go to there used to be a theater, a movie theater up in Redby, and that's whatever, about 15 miles from our farm. We used to go up there quite often to the movies. And so I had experiences with the Indian people, and sometimes in the book I compare things that I see with the Vietnamese, out in the rural areas, because we were 99% out in the rural areas. We were never around cities, thank goodness. But much of their lifestyle reminded me of what you saw up on Red Lake in the 1950s and 60s. Anyway, I juxtaposed the two cultures, and I think it came across. I've gotten a lot of interesting comments on that. Like I mentioned, it took me 10 years to write the book because I had to learn how to write. It was published in 2012 and put on Amazon for sale and whatnot. My daughter actually wrote the first review. And she wrote, it's a longer review, you can go on there and read it, but she says, my father never spoke to us of his time in Vietnam, so this is all new to me. And she's 40 years old. And, it's one of the things that we talk about, veterans. In today's world, there's a lot of female veterans. Veterans basically don't like to talk about their experiences. And it's difficult, it's not macho to start getting teared up. People can't possibly understand your experience. We don't want to burden our loved ones, so we stay quiet about it. And our loved ones don't understand why we're quiet. So I got an email from a soldier that was in the well deck that was wounded that day I talked about earlier. And this might be on Amazon, I forget. Anyway, it's quite lengthy. He wrote, you don't know how much your book meant to me, Wendell. I don't remember everything that happened that day. I was only lightly wounded and finished the operation. 3rd Platoon was wiped out. Another soldier who was in the well deck was Stafford Cowles. He helped to kick some of those burning ammo and grenade cases over the side. I am still in touch with him, but he moved to Guatemala last year. He was wounded pretty bad that day and choppered out. The Latino you mentioned using a bunk may have been Hector Lugo Mojica. He was KIA, killed matching. Your book confirmed some things that I remembered but could not confirm. One was that I thought I saw a medevac chopper shot down. Thank you for letting me know that I didn't imagine that. Another was about the hook not letting the ramp down. I sat at the front of the ATC at one point, armored troop carrier, at one point when we were beached to discourage Charlie, Viet Cong, from tossing grenades or firing another rocket. I have more details I would like to share and some questions to ask. I was 3rd Platoon radio operator and should have known the name of the black sergeant who took over the empty .50 caliber turret, but I cannot think of it. I still have my orders awarding me the Purple Heart. Maybe his name is on it. I will look for my Vietnam storage box. I look forward to continuing our conversation. I'm very glad you survived that day. The official records say that we only lost 4 people, but I doubt their KIA count and would like to find out how many more died of wounds within a few days of that ambush. A couple comments on this email that I'm sure you don't understand. When we were on operations, transporting troops, if we got in an ambush, I would turn the boat and ram the bunker because they build their machine gun bunkers right into the riverbanks because they're so low. But anyway, I would ram the bunkers and drop the ramp on top of them. Well, that particular day, there was a safety latch on the front ramp that our engineman down below was supposed to release before I could hit the lever to drop the ramp. Because if that ramp accidentally, if the cable snapped and that ramp dropped, you'd be submerged. You'd just be like a giant spoon scooping underwater. So anyway, we took those rockets, those first few seconds, and I don't know why the engineman didn't get up there. Maybe he couldn't, maybe he was too terrified to, I don't know. He didn't release that latch, and so the ramp didn't go down, so these guys were all trapped in there. And this Larry at the time, and I didn't know this when I wrote the book, but this guy that wrote this email actually climbed up that ramp and started shooting down into the bunker because they were trying to throw grenades on our boat. So that was one thing that I learned. The other thing is he mentions this black sergeant. Well, one of our Navy gunners turned coward and abandoned his station and left our gun mount, our 50 caliber turret empty. And a black Army sergeant came up from below deck. There was a little hatch right next to where I stood driving the boat that went from down in the well deck up to the deck I was on. Anyway, this black Army sergeant, without hesitation, came up that ladder and crawled into that gun turret and started firing, and within just moments, rocket burned through that armor plating and just really severely wounded him. And that has troubled me all these years because I suspect I'm one of the very few people that really realized what happened. And I've always thought, you know, in 2 tours of duty I did in Vietnam, he was really the only hero that I saw. You know, everybody else pretty much did their duty, but he did something heroic, and I've always felt that he should be recognized for that. And anyway, I didn't know who he was. This past August 2013, my wife Patty and I went to Indianapolis for a Mobile Marine Force Association reunion. And I met Larry, the guy that wrote that email, and we visited quite a bit. And anyway, I had a booth set up selling my book. And the second day, Larry came over to the booth all excited. And he said, I found 3 more Army guys that were down in the well deck that day. And so we got together and visited and whatnot, but excuse me. I didn't personally know them because we would carry different platoons of Army troops. And back on the main river, it isn't like we were segregated, but the Army didn't really associate with the Navy. We just each did our own thing. So I had no idea who this black Army sergeant was. But at the reunion, I found his name, and I kind of stood back, and one of the things you learn when you learn how to write is to be an observer, to listen and just watch a lot. And that's what I kind of did as these four Army guys, and like I say, they all knew each other from back in '68. I didn't really know them. And so I kind of stood back and listened and participated a little bit in conversation. But 2 themes came through really loud and clear. And I don't mean to gross you all out. The first thing that came through very loud and clear as a memory, and I call it a flashbulb memory because everybody remembered it almost identical, like it was a picture. And that was of all the blood in the well deck. When someone is wounded and they're on the ground, you know, it soaks in, or just, you know, it disappears mostly. I mean, the stains are still there. But on a boat, you have the 5-foot bulkheads, steel bulkheads, you have a steel deck, and there's nowhere for the blood to go. And so it was splattered on the bulkheads. It coagulated on the deck in the low spots. And that was a vision, a memory that we all held together. The other thing that came across really powerfully to me was a survivor guilt, which is a major characteristic of PTSD. We were all amazed that we were still alive. First, that we had survived that day, but secondly, that 45 years later, we're all still upright and in reasonably decent health. So those, and like I say, I learned the name of that black sergeant. And most people, only one guy actually remembered him. His name was Sergeant Thomas. He was a career guy. He was a little older than us, and he had apparently only been transferred to that 3rd platoon a week or 2 before this ambush. But on April 5th, just a few weeks ago, I got this email from a guy, or yeah, I think it was an email. Wendell, my name is Lawrence Salzman, and I was in Delta Echo Company, 4th of the 47th. I don't think I was with you guys August 18th. I was back on the Benoit being treated for immersion foot. Benoit was a barracks ship that stayed in the main river in the Mekong. Immersion foot, the Army troops had a lot of trouble because in the Delta is almost all rice paddies, and so they were almost always, their feet were wet, and usually we'd only be on like 2 to 3 day operations for that simple reason. But anyway, immersion foot was still a big problem with them. The black sergeant you mentioned in your article's name was Thomas. I have a picture of him I will send you. And so if you go on my website, I have some bookmarkers here that has my website on, everybody can take. If you go on my website, you'll see articles that I've posted about this reunion and lots of things. But it's a picture of Sergeant Thomas. Well, about a week after I got that picture, another veteran emailed me. He had another picture of Sergeant Thomas. I got an email from a lady whose brother was a helicopter gunner, and she's real active in the POW MIA community. And she had seen my post, and she discovered a Sergeant Thomas that died on August 18th, 1968. And I was really excited about that. Well, we did some more research and discovered he had been in the 199th Light Infantry, I think it was, and he had died of hepatitis. So she was going to do a little more research because she said a lot of times these records aren't accurate. So I'm waiting to hear back from her. As we age, we hope to make some sense of our experiences, and in a perfect world, maybe we leave the world a little better place. And I feel like maybe with publishing my book, I've helped a few people. Here's a review I got from a guy on Amazon. Sometimes I look calm, cool, and collected on the outside, but the inside will be going 90 to nothing, and the mind will be back in that world. I think this book eased a few of those feelings, but just knowing that someone else that has been in the exact same spot as me was having the same thoughts and feelings. Maybe it justified my feelings or something like that. Since I'm not a writer, it's hard to put in words. And that was kind of touching. I've gotten quite a few comments like that, and just at book signings. Like I was at the Clearwater County Fair a couple of years ago doing a book signing, and I was surprised. One of the things that surprised me when I sell books is I sell more of them to women. I think I mentioned that. I sell more books to women than to men. But quite a few men came over to me and thanked me for writing the book. I had one man today was telling me, thanks for telling my story, our story. A lot of veterans feel like it is their story because it's an experience we all had in common. Another blog comment I got just recently. I cannot believe I'm revisiting your book. By strange chance, my daughter asked me if I ever read Muddy Jungle Rivers, and I was stunned to find it was being used as a teaching tool at Indiana University's sociology program. What an excellent teaching tool and guide to understanding PTSD. I really enjoyed conveying your story and the emotion she showed listening to your story. I truly respect and honor you and your fellow soldiers for serving your country in a war that was misunderstood, mishandled, and never recognized properly. God bless and care for all our veterans. You should be proud. I don't know this gentleman. I'm quite certain he's probably not a veteran just from the tone of that message. But he's very respectful of our experience. And you know, a lot of people I've met in the writing community were anti-war protesters. I mean, now they're in academia and a lot of them are professors and whatnot. But one of the things, there's still a few hardcore, you know, anti-war protesters still fighting the war. But overwhelmingly, the majority of them today, I don't know if feel bad is the right word, but they accepted our experience, and I think they've come to the realization that to have attacked us verbally, not much physically, but verbally, was not the right way to go. They should have gone after the government that sent us, you know, that made the decisions. And so that's really a message that has come across loud to me. And I had my experience, some of you have read the book. I had an experience with the anti-war protesters when I came back. And I went back down to where it happened and discovered why they had done what they did. And so, anyway, like I say, I've made peace with that. The VA diagnosed me with PTSD more than 20 years ago. If someone told me that I'd be standing here today talking about it, I'd just go, they're nuts. You know, not in a million years would I talk about it. I didn't talk about it to anyone. We all develop coping skills. I'm sure there's veterans in this room that have never talked about it, you know, their experiences, and silence is a coping skill. Maybe you like to just get out and go for a walk and just appreciate the quiet. For me, writing has become a coping skill. I do other writing now. I'm in the process of, actually, I have a manuscript. It's not a Vietnam book, but it's a manuscript that's ready to go to an editor. But I pulled up a statistic that I found interesting, and that is that 30% of veterans that are in the VA system today that are being actively treated have PTSD. They've been diagnosed with PTSD. And that's kind of a scary statistic, and it's sad with this younger generation that are coming back, these multiple tours and the better body armor they have, so there's a higher survivability rate, if that's a word. It's creating a much larger population of veterans with traumatic brain injuries and also with PTSD. And it's tough on the families. Our daughter that wrote that first Amazon thing that I read, her husband is in the Air Force, and he's been, they live down in Tucson, he's been at least 4 or 5 tours in the last few years, deployments. So it's just a strain on family life. But when a young person comes home today, if you have a friend or a family or whatever that has been deployed, I guess people wonder, what can we do? You're kind of at a loss. And my best advice is to give them space. One of the things we don't stop to realize is that life has moved on. I know one of the things that Vietnam veterans confronted, had to deal with, being in, like I was in for 4 years, a lot of the guys that were drafted were in for 2 years. During that time you were gone in the military, your peers have moved on. They're in college or halfway through college or graduated. They've started families, and so there's this disconnect right from the get-go. You know, you're coming back to a community where, hell, I just graduated from high school. Okay, you've been gone these years, so it's a struggle, even if you haven't been in a life-threatening situation. It's still a gap to be filled when you return home. So, like I say, I highly recommend when a young person comes home, just listen and don't judge them. One of the complaints that I've heard time and time again is that families' advice, if the veteran does try to talk, they're told, don't talk about it, forget about it, move on with your life. Well, people that have been exposed to the horrors of war or to the aftermath, people that have worked in hospitals and seen the trauma, you don't forget about it. It's something you need to learn to live with. And if vets groups are a way of dealing with it. I think they've come a long way since what I attended in the 1990s. There's a lot of new therapies out there other than medication. I recommend, veterans at least giving them a try. For me, and it's like I mentioned earlier, sharing the trauma, sharing the story is probably the first step to healing and to living with that. And like I say, you don't forget it, but you learn to live with it. Writing is again a recognized tool for PTSD treatment. Walter Reed Army Hospital and the National Endowment for the Arts collaborated with this. It's a nonprofit out on the East Coast. It's called Veterans Writing Project, and they do workshops and writing programs for veterans that have been diagnosed with PTSD or veterans that are just recuperating in Walter Reed. And it's been extremely successful. You can Google it. There's quite a bit written about it. I credit those World War II vets for inspiring me to tell my story. And today, when I speak to groups, when there's young veterans in the crowd, I just tell them, write your stories. You don't have to share them with anyone, but if you put them on paper, they start making sense to you if you can start putting them in order rather than just a collage of disparate memories, if that makes sense. It helps you realize and understand and make some sense of that experience that you lived. And I always tell them there is room for post-traumatic growth. That's a term we rarely ever hear. I don't know if it's because therapists don't want veterans to think, oh yeah, I'm going to get all better, or I'm going to become a better person. But the fact is that there is room for growth and to, live a reasonably happy life. So I brought some brochures today here if anyone's interested. And does anyone have any questions? Geez, I covered it all.
I just have a couple of comments. During World War I, my father served in World War I, and he would not talk about his experiences. When I asked him, he would just say, I operated a telephone switchboard. And that's all he would talk about. That's all he would say. But we didn't call it PTSD, we called it shell shock.
Yes.
And one of the people who, a salesman, called in our store, my father once told me that he had had shell shock. He was sort of a jittery type of guy. A very nice fellow, but he was a little bit shaky and a little bit jittery. And my father said he had shell shock. So that was my first experience with what is now called PTSD. In World War II, we called it battle fatigue.
Yes.
It's all the same thing.
That's absolutely right. That's correct. Thank you. Yes, that's exactly right. And it's been around since the beginning of time. A lot of these Greek tragedies that you read, Iliad and the Odyssey, those are journeys, metaphoric journeys, a big part of them, of returning home from wars. And in the Civil War, for example, he called it soldier's heart. Okay? And so there's been, PTSD has been around forever. But finally, Vietnam veterans kind of brought it out of the closet. And I'm very thankful to see today that the public recognizes it. When someone comes home and they have an arm or a leg that's been blown away, they're disabled. You can't see inside their mind. And so it's hard for many people to realize or understand that this person is actually suffering a disability. Yes, sir.
Were you ever in a typhoon and blew off the sea where the water was just like it rained, so it was just like you were walking through the shower?
Actually, yes, sir. I was in a typhoon once, and it was in the Taiwan Straits between Formosa and Chinese mainland. When I was the first time I went to Vietnam, I was on a destroyer, and we were going from, I don't even remember, But anyway, we were passing through the Taiwan Straits, and I was on the bridge. I was a boatswain mate, if anyone's familiar with Navy terminology, so I would stand bridge watches and whatnot. And I remember there's I forget what it's called, but there's a dial that hangs up on the pilot house on the bridge, and it shows how far the ship will sway each way. So we had, and on a destroyer isn't a real huge ship, but the bridge is 30 feet above the water line, I suppose. We would plow, and you never want to go with the seas. You always plow into them, and you don't go sideways. You don't go perpendicular to them. You always go into the head sea. Anyway, we had literally clear blue water, solid water hitting these bridge windows, you know, and the windows are about 1 inch thick, and they're safety glass, and otherwise, I've heard of them being blown out by the pressure of the water. I never witnessed that. But this dial was actually rolling up to 33 degrees on each way, so we were rolling 66 degrees in that typhoon. And you talk about, you think these old salts that brag about not getting seasick, some of them weren't. Any other questions? Yes?
I believe the instrument you're referring to is called a clinometer. A clinometer.
Clinometer, okay.
Yes.
Okay, okay, you're familiar with it.
Yes, I was in the Navy.
Okay. Yes, ma'am?
What does coxswain mean?
A coxswain, if you read Mark Twain, it's a coxswain is a full pronunciation. It's kind of abbreviated coxswain, C-O-X apostrophe N. Generally, a coxswain is, in the old days, was more like a pilot. By the time Vietnam was, a coxswain referred to anyone driving a small craft. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Do you belong to any kind of support group now? You said initially the veterans groups didn't really work for you. Do you now belong to any of those groups? Or
I don't. There's a new one that just started in Bemidji, and I've gone to it a few times. In fact, I've been invited to speak at it. I've gone to this one in Bemidji a couple times. It meets at the library twice a month. I have some brochures for it. It's actually, I'm pretty impressed with it. It's through the Vet Center, which is a branch of the Veterans Administration, VA. The lady that is the facilitator is an Iraqi war veteran. And it's kind of interesting. She lives over in Duluth. She comes over to Bemidji twice a month for these meetings. But it's kind of interesting. Both she and her brothers all served together at the same time, and she was a medic. And I mentioned earlier, about remembering traumas. She wasn't in actual combat, but being a medic, she was exposed to, people that had been severely injured. And those are the kind of things that you don't forget. I mean, some of my worst memories is when I spent about 10 days in a hospital in Japan, and they would transport the more seriously wounded and very severely wounded out of country to the better medical facilities. And I always remember some of the patients I saw there. It was just heart-wrenching. Yeah, and those are things you just don't forget. Yes, ma'am.
For a high school dropout, you appear to be very learned and well educated. I caught your referrals to the Iliad and the Odyssey and being a poetry reader and so on. What further education did you avail yourself of, or have you been self-taught?
We have a farm down by Shovelin. We're not real active on, now we rent it out, but for many years we were active farming. But I read a lot. I haven't for the last few years because I've just been too darn busy, but I take classes at BSU. You know, if you have grandchildren or children or whatnot, or even senior citizens, I'll tell you, I highly recommend taking classes. You know, and this is a perfect proof, Northern Exposure for Lifelong Learning. If you're over 65, you can get senior citizen rates, which are next to nothing. I mean, they're like, whatever, a couple $100 a month for a class. And it's amazing how much you learn. And what I've learned in these classes, a lot of times the professors, I mean, they're like my granddaughters or grandsons, they'll defer to me sometimes, you know, especially in things that they're not sure about. So, you know, when students are asking questions. So I highly recommend taking classes, credit classes or non-credit, I don't know exactly, you can audit the classes. BSU is really a wonderful resource that we have locally. There is a veteran support group on campus there also, and there's another one at the VA clinic right in Bemidji. So I called, what's his name, Hutch, the Clearwater County Veteran Service Officer, because I wanted to know if there was a local resource here, and he said that he wasn't aware of any. And he gave me Les's number over in Polk County and said to ask him, and I didn't get a chance to give him a call. So does anyone know in this audience if there are veteran support groups anywhere in this area? You know, at one time, like when I was going to this group in the 90s, nobody knew about it because, you know, and even today, some people think, wow, he must be kind of a weakling that he got to do that, he can't carry his load. Well, because there's kind of a stigma to go to these groups. And I guess personally I disagree with that. And I'd like to think that today's population is enlightened enough with these new veterans coming home that, you know, that's not really the case anymore. Yes, ma'am.
Something we could all do, what my husband does. He's gonna kill me. If you see a service person, walk up to him, shake their hand and thank them.
Yes, that is very meaningful and heartfelt for a lot of veterans. I agree. Yes, ma'am.
My teenage years were all involved in World War II.
You don't look old enough.
The highlight of living in a small town was going to the Saturday night dance. And after the dance, which ended at 1 o'clock, we would all walk down to the, first thing that goes is your memory, down to the railroad station to say goodbye to any of the young boys that were drafted.
Okay.
And the sad part was you also welcomed the ones home in the casket.
Yes.
And that was sad.
That is very sad.
And there was one man, he had a laugh like Woody Woodpecker. Does anybody remember? Does somebody want to? Come on. Let's hear a Woody Woodpecker. So there was a movie, and there came that laugh. And everybody stopped and stood up and looked around, because there was our sailor boy home from the war, alive. You know? And the movie, they had to close it down and turn it on so everybody could see him and hug him and cheer him on, you know, with a laugh like that. So that was my memories of the war.
That's a wonderful memory. That's a wonderful memory. You know, you talk about World War II, the book that I'm working on right now, it's the first in a series of books. My mother spent 60 years on our farm in Nevish, and when she died in 2010, I was her administrator and whatnot, and locked in our chicken house was our family history. When my grandmother out in Seattle died in 1984, my mother had it shipped to the farm and locked in the chicken house, and she would never, literally it was padlocked shut. She would never let anyone go in and go through these things. And so after she died, the last 4 years, that's one reason I haven't been taking classes, I've spent countless hours going through thousands and thousands of pages. I have this big scanner. I scan, a lot of it was just junk. But I didn't throw anything away because, and I'm thankful I didn't, because now after I've learned a lot, some of this, what I thought was junk, makes sense. So I'm going back and revisiting it. But what I did over the last several years, I scanned documents and pictures and diaries, and I have a folder for each one, so I can pull up, and I title everything chronologically, year, month, date. So I can pull up, I have maybe 20 folders for different characters, different people, my grandparents, my aunt, and so forth. I can pull up any date from any year and see exactly what they were all doing. And the reason I mention this, a lot of it is this first book I have, going to my editor, takes place just before the Second World War. My mother was studying music in France, in Belgium actually, and she had gone home to spend some time with a Polish girlfriend of hers. And it was the summer of 1939. Well, anyone that remembers their history, Hitler invaded Poland September 1st, 1939. And so my mother did get out of there literally the week that Hitler was amassing his troops on the Polish border. And she carried a lot of bad memories. She lost all her friends. She had a fiance that was Polish. She lost all of them, and I made some very interesting discoveries. And from the primary documents I have, and then I'm very fortunate, I gotta track this lady down now, but in Beltrami County History Center was this young lady that just was artist at doing research. And I had this proposal letter. It was a letter written in Polish, and I didn't have a clue what it was. So I had a lady at the college translate it for me. And what it was is a proposal letter that this Polish army officer had written to my mother. And so I had his name, Krzysztof Karnapika was his name. So anyway, I gave it to this friend of mine that worked at the History Center, and I asked her if she could do some research for me. And she tracked down and got all his information, his family information. I was fortunate I had quite a bit of information on him. And what she discovered was that he had been captured. If you recall your World War II history, Germany invaded from the east, or from the west rather, and on September 1st, and on September 27th, the Russians came in from the west. Well, this Krzysztof was captured by the Russians. And this lady discovered, my researcher discovered, that he was murdered by the Russians in the Katayan Forest Massacre in 1940, in the spring of 1940. There's monuments to all these. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the Katayan Forest Massacre. The Russians murdered, and their estimates vary anywhere from 20 to 25,000 Polish army officers and anyone that was educated, for example. They wanted to completely wipe out Polish society and their ability to govern themselves. And that's one reason you wonder why Poland is today it's come back quite a ways. But after World War II, that was one of their big problems. They didn't have anyone left that knew anything about governing. So that was an issue my mother dealt with. She never knew what happened to this man, and she was gone before I learned that. Are there other questions?
It appears that you have a lot of books still inside.
I have quite a few. Well, thank you very much. I have some brochures up here from the Vet Center and about PTSD. I have some books here if anyone would like one. So, must be coffee time.
Well, most of the we did go down to Arizona for a couple of weeks. There's some rented a house down there.
And